Thank you, Alan. Yes, and it is sort of amazingly coming towards the end of my first year as chairman. I took over from my predecessor, Andreas Bergman, at the very beginning of the year, and it's been a complete whirlwind since that point in time. I was musing on this session, and also, you know, one of the things that's sort of very much in my mind, having, if you like, just got my feet under the table, is that we're now beginning to think about, you know, what's the next stage for IPSASB, and this. You know, the title for this event, Beyond Base Camp, actually resonated very strongly with me, because I think, you know, as I'll talk a little bit more about later on, next year is the 20th anniversary of the start of the IPSAS standard setting program, and it really feels like IPSAS have now come of age as a set of global standards for the public sector. We've come a long way in 20 years, and again, I'd just like to acknowledge Ian Ball here as really, I guess, the father of the IPSAS program, and I think it's amazing how far we have actually come in that. So the Beyond Base Camp really resonated with me. What am I going to talk about? Well, I'll talk a little bit about the journey that we've come on, who the board is, and so on. I'll talk also about momentum in adoption. Armin mentioned that, and it really does feel, sort of having taken on the mantle of IPSAS board chairman, I've travelled a lot during the year, and it's amazing, whatever region of the world I go to, IPSAS are being talked about, and people are really saying, either, you know, we're adopting these and these are working for us, or we need to move to accrual, and IPSAS are going to be the basis that we will adopt. And I'll also just talk a bit further in the last part of the talk about, if you like, the sorts of things that we see as the challenges going forward over the next few years. And really, I'll start at the point where Armin left off, which is in terms of the strategic objective that IPSASB adopted following public consultation in 2015. It was to set our work in the context of strengthening public financial management. We as a board firmly believe that accrual reporting is the basis for that. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. There's a lot more that goes into that, and really that was the reason for why we've structured the session today, because I think Armin showed you the various other elements of that, and I know that's been talked about, you know, yesterday as well as today. So what are we as a board doing? Well, you know, as a standards board, you'd expect us to be setting high quality standards for financial reporting. That's our core business. We've also, over the years, developed a suite of background literature which talks about some of the experiences earlier in the process in terms of adoption around the world. But we've also developed some non-mandatory guidance. And really one of our purposes is actually to raise awareness of the benefits of IPSAS and of the standards themselves. So we have those three strands to our work. Who are we? Well, we are an independent standard setting board. We work a term under the auspices of IFAC, so IFAC facilitates a lot of our operation, but a lot of the work that's gone in over the last few years has really been to strengthen our independence. The board home base is Toronto, where we have a secretariat of 8, and part of the reason that we're based in Toronto is really the very strong support, both financial and physical, that we've had from the government in Canada and the profession in Canada. The board itself is 18 members from around the world, from a variety of backgrounds, not only standard setting, but also preparers, auditors, academics, and so on. So a very high degree of debate, and really all coming from the public sector. One of the key developments for the last couple of years has been the development of the governance and the advisory arrangements around the board. Certainly, as Thomas will mention, in terms of the European public sector accounting standards process, one of the strong criticisms of the board a few years back was that it didn't have independent oversight. Well, we now have the Public Interest Committee comprising World Bank, IMF, OECD and NTSI overseeing the process process that we apply in developing our standards. And more recently, during 2016, we've actually put in place the Consultative Advisory Group, which Thomas chairs. And again, that's a very broad-based group in terms of stakeholders who have an interest in our work, not only preparers but also representatives of civil society, parliamentarians and so on. And that's really meant to provide a very strong input, very strong grounding in the practical world of public financial management as we go through setting our standards. Thus far, we've set, we have 34 standards sort of in place and active. If you follow our work, you'll know that we're now up to IPSAS 39, but there's a few that we've withdrawn along the way, so it's roughly around 34. We've also set guidance for non-financial reporting in areas where we recommend that jurisdictions actually do report. For example, if they're reporting on non-financial performance targets, there's a standard on that, as well as financial sustainability in the long term for governments, and we see that as absolutely crucial. It's not just about what the financial position is at the moment, it's about the medium to longer term, and are the current policies actually sustainable in financial terms. And you need that medium to longer term perspective, as I'll explain in a minute, because of the nature of government, but also because of the influences on sustainability going forwards in terms of changes in the population ageing, changes in healthcare practices and so on. I think one of the fundamental pieces of work that we have actually completed, though, was the conceptual framework, which we approved in 2014. And what we've done there is actually to articulate what we see as the really crucial and differentiating factors around reporting in the public sector. Key is non-exchange transactions, both income in terms of taxes, but also the way in which government provides benefits for individuals and through programs. We heard about agriculture and so on. And those are not in the kind of conventional contractual framework that you have in the private sector. So we're setting standards for that. Accountability for public money, the role of the approved budget and performance against that, we see as absolutely crucial. Certainly when we were debating the objectives of financial reporting in the public sector, whereas the private sector International Accounting Standards Board says decision making is its primary objective, we've adopted two: accountability and decision making. I mentioned the longer term focus for government. Government provides assets as well as services, so roads and other forms of infrastructure, and it doesn't just invest in assets to generate a return, it invests in those to provide services longer term. So you need to think about that longer term perspective, the ways in which services are provided using assets for the service potential, not the commercial return. Challenge, yes, in terms of one of the functions of government is actually to act as a regulator. Does that mean that it controls organisations through that? So you need to think about that. And then again, also picking up on one of the points that Armin made, government finance statistics and building the linkages between the audited accrual information that you can develop through using IPSAS, not only at an individual entity level, but also at a consolidated level, and feeding that into government finance statistics, which are used for the macroeconomic decisions and for comparisons between countries. And we really see that as one of the absolutely crucial features that we do work on already, but I think that's an area for work going forwards. So just a brief history of where we've come over the last 20 years. And when Ian started the programme off, the priority was to achieve as complete coverage as possible. So the focus really to begin with was those areas where essentially the public sector enters into the same transactions as the private sector. And the view in terms of accountability is, if they're the same transactions, account for them in the same way. You may need actually to help people in terms of application of those through changes in terminology, through through changes in the examples that you use, but essentially use the same framework if it's appropriate. And I stress if it's appropriate, because I think you then go back into those characteristics of public sector reporting, and you need to bear those in mind. And IPSASB has a very strong process, if it starts from ISB literature as the start point, of reviewing it in the context of those characteristics of public sector reporting. So having moved to provide a start point, the second phase then we started looking at those public sector areas, particularly non-exchange transactions, and that's where our first really specific standard on non-exchange revenue taxes and transfers came through during that point. Maintaining the focus on keeping convergence where appropriate with private sector standards, and the start of our conceptual framework. And that really was a key focus for the third phase under my predecessor, Andreas Bergman, who was chairman of the board for 6 years. Both Thomas and I served during that time, which was really, there was a very strong focus on getting the conceptual framework for the public sector in place. Not an interpretation of the ISB's conceptual framework, although we've used the ideas from that where they're appropriate. It is a framework for public sector reporting, starting from that public sector perspective. We also put in place guidance on first-time adoption, and importantly, and I think this is part of the theme of IPSASB coming of age, really starting to connect with our constituents. People are increasingly adopting our standards. We did our first consultation on, well, what are the topics that are important to you? We want your feedback, we want your priorities. Out of that grew our current work programme. And what we've tried to do here is balance the demand for us to address purely public sector topics with maintaining convergence with the major changes in IFRS. And you can see the key new standards over the last few years that ISB has issued in terms of IFRS 9 financial instruments, the recent standard on revenue and on leases. We're bringing those in, but we're balancing that with a strongly public sector focused programme. And if you look at that list, you can see we're tackling major areas here of government expenditure and social benefits. We're also re-examining the approach that we've taken to accounting for revenue. Does the split that we have at the moment between exchange and non-exchange actually work? Also bringing in big areas in non-exchange expenditure, health, defence, and other collective goods and services. And that's a project where we are hoping to issue a consultation paper early next year. Financial instruments I mentioned, also heritage, something that governments around the world have. What are the key features of that? Are they different from other types of assets, or even are heritage items liabilities? We're addressing all of those again in the consultation paper that we are hoping to approve in a few weeks' time at our meeting in South Africa. And then moving on to the topic I raised about, well, what's the perspective that you should take in terms of valuing assets in the public sector? And we certainly covered the idea about measurement in the conceptual framework, but it's at a very high level. We're starting a project now which is actually looking at how do you use those high-level concepts in practice, reaching out to other communities, the statistical community, the valuation community, really trying to get a shared view on what are we actually asking for, why are we asking for it, how do you use the information, making sure that it's fit for purpose in terms of the various different communities. Infrastructure assets, big roads, power, water, fundamental infrastructure there, and then also the major changes in lease accounting, looking at those. And that, I think you can see from that, we're hitting at the moment major areas of income, expenditure, and in the balance sheet. So a big programme, but really some very exciting topics there, and real public sector focus in the coming years. So where are we in terms of implementation? And this is a survey that PwC have done on 2 occasions now. just central government here, not local government, but really focusing on where is accrual actually implemented at the moment. And that's the picture that you see at the moment. So I think it's probably consistent with the sort of figures that Armin was saying in terms of 30% of governments. And one of the challenges here is that what you find is that governments actually may well be adopting IPSAS, but if you go to the Philippines, they're Philippines public sector accounting standards or Malaysian public sector accounting standards. So it's quite a challenge actually determining exactly who is using our standards. If you then look forwards 5 years, this is the projected picture in 5 years' time, and I think you'll see huge change projected during that time, and that's why it really feels like these standards are actually coming of age now, because they really are being used, and particularly, for example, Latin America, you see that the majority of countries will actually be adopting the standards over the next 5 to 10 years. So what challenges do we see? Well, the work programme that I've described actually really does have some challenging projects on there, and particularly social benefits was a project that the board did start in the early mid-2000s, and actually having consulted 3 times on that, it was really proving too challenging till we'd actually completed the conceptual framework. So we've gone back to that. You know, we're really using the conceptual framework now to hit the issues, and the exposure draft that we'll issue on social benefits during 2017 is very strongly built around conceptual framework. The standards being used more around the world means we need to connect with our constituents in a way that we haven't before. So we are really putting a focus on building relationships with the national standard setters, and in March this year we held the first forum with public sector standard setters in the US. I've given you the dates for the next one, which will be held in Zurich in partnership with the Swiss standard setter, and this is really, the focus is us communicating the state of play in terms of developing our standards, but them telling us what the issues are, you know, in terms of the way they're tackling it, their sorts of thoughts on what should come into our programme going forwards. When you look at the PFM landscape, there's a lot of different players there, and I think we have to acknowledge our part as part of that landscape, but also to connect with the other players in that. And that's where, you know, for the sorts of initiatives that Armin was talking about, I'm tremendously encouraged, because I think the power of those international and those regional organisations acting as advocates, pushing reform, is tremendously important. So I think building our relationships there, making sure we're in line with what they're doing is very important. Making our governance structure work as well. It's still in the relatively early days, and I think you know, there's quite a lot that we need to do just to actually make sure that we're getting the most out of that, and therefore our stakeholders will be. And they're being demanding. Certainly the pressure is on in terms of the social benefits project, and are we as a board really properly connected with our constituents in terms of membership and so on. So some challenges there. If we look forward, and this is really about the next year or two as we start to look at our next work plan consultation, there's quite a list of projects that people would like us to tackle, and maintaining this balance between public sector and bringing in the latest developments in the IFRS literature. Depending on where you go in the world, people will either say maintaining convergence with IFRS is absolutely crucial. If you go somewhere else, people will say cut the links with IFRS, you need to focus on the public sector. We need to do both. And then how do you support adoption and implementation? And that is an issue for all standards boards. And again, I think we go back to the links with the various other different international and regional organisations. We certainly need to be transparent about our activities, and I think that is one of the challenges. There's still further to go in terms of really demonstrating our independence. Just finishing off then in terms of opportunities, appropriate to mention, given where we are, the European Public Sector Accounting Standards programme, and Thomas will talk a bit more about that. I think that the role of IPSAS is becoming clearer in that programme, and this momentum going on. And it's not just in the developed world. I think, the kind of initial phases, probably the debate was more focused around that, but I think the move of New Zealand from IFRS-based reporting to IPSAS-based reporting was really important. There's a program over the next couple of years in Canada to move from their national standards to examine the role of IPSAS in that. And as I go around the world, literally everywhere I go, people are talking about adoption of IPSAS. So whether it's Latin America, whether it's Southeast Asia, or Africa, you see countries moving to adopt the standards. I mentioned advocacy, and certainly that's something where IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants, has become much more aware of public financial management and strong public financial management and governance as being really important. Their Accountability Now campaign, I think, is crucial in terms of awareness. And we certainly plan to use next year as the 20th anniversary year as a tool for raising awareness. I mentioned the Public Sector Standards Setters Forum in Zurich. We have a follow-up date in Canada organised for 2018. And then the future. So next year we'll be building the consultation on the work plan going forwards, and really that's where we need to be open to feedback on the shape of that programme going forwards. As people are really starting to use our standards, are we hitting the right areas? Is the guidance good enough in terms of focus, application, implementation guidance, and so on? So hopefully I've shown you that there's a lot going on. The standards really are being used around the world, and I think this is a really exciting programme going forwards, and I hope you'll all engage with that. Thank you.